hope this is visible, is it? Shweta, I
Yes.
hope you're able to see this.
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right, thank you. So it gives us this highlighter kind of an effect. And for those of us who might be wondering, oh, what if yellow is not my favorite color? Mark is an element after all. You are free to style it. I'll say that again. Mark is an element, so you're free to style it. I mean, you would want to use a different color. Some of us may say, okay, we would want to use a fluorescent pink or something like that that stands out. Feel free. It's an element. You can certainly bring in whatever CSS that you feel is appropriate in that context. Okay, so we've taken a look at date, we've taken a look at time. All of these are elements that would help us structure our HTML document. In addition, we also have two new elements that have been introduced, figure and figure caption. Figure, I could use these to group a set of images. Let us say I have a group of images, or rather a collection of IMG tags, and I want to group them because they possibly constitute something collectively. I could group them within a figure, and I could have a caption for the group as a whole. Figure caption. This is something that I could resort to. Excuse me. Again, let me quickly point out, none of these usages have any built-in formatting. Therefore, just because I have enclosed these two images within a figure tag, please do not be under the impression that there's going to be some kind of a border added or some kind of a grouping visually. Nothing of that kind is going to happen. As you can observe, and I hope you have, the title of the slide says these are structural elements, elements that we are primarily using to structure our document. As we have discussed previously, anything to do with formatting, we would want to move that into CSS. That's essentially the crux of what is being emphasized. All right. Having said that, we have spoken about a few deprecations a little while ago. I'd like to add a couple more to that list. Applet is no longer supported. It's been replaced by a tag called object. BG sound no longer expected to be used. It's been replaced by a tag called audio. Center, font, and frame center. This is something we've already talked about, so I guess I don't need to revisit that again. We would want to be using CSS equivalents. These are deprecations. Further, align and border properties of the IMG tag, not expected to be used. Instead, use CSS. IMG tag had a property called border. It had a property called align. Don't use those. Instead, use CSS. Now, this could come as a bit of a surprise. The non-breaking space. We had this entity, and we have quite a number of entities like this. NBSP happens to be just one example. In HTML, I hope everyone recollects there are quite a number of entities like these. There's the NBSP, there's the LT, GT, APOS, QUOT, quite a number of entities like that. We are being told, instead of using the literal values, we're supposed to be using the decimal equivalent instead. I'll repeat that again. Don't use the literal values of these entities. Use the decimal equivalents instead. Food for thought, maybe. I will intentionally leave the reasoning behind it unanswered, and I would request you to see if you can try figuring out a little of why this is something that is being suggested. So in simple English, it's like saying, oh, please don't use NBSP. Instead, use the decimal equivalent, which is the #160. Now, there obviously has to be some reasoning behind it. Incidentally, there are two reasons which are very significant and they're logical. I would request you to try figuring out what the reasons for this could possibly be. The switch from the literal to the decimal equivalents, respectively. This is, by the way, question number 2 for our homework. Question number 1, if I may gently remind everyone, was in the context of the ISO Unicode comparison. Okay, and this is question number 2. Okay, we've talked about a number of deprecations so far. Here, we've also talked about a number of enhancements. There are quite a number of new characteristics and features and all of that that have been introduced. Even as we're talking about these, it's going to be unfair if we don't look at some of the enhancements or some of the developments that are happening specifically in the CSS world. So what are the new features? I mean, is there anything new, groundbreaking, something that CSS would certainly want to showcase? Apparently, there are quite a few new features that we certainly intend to be stepping into or we would want to appreciate. All right. Now, I have a question, though, that I said I would want to bring up here. We propose to be looking at features of CSS as in CSS3. A question that I have, therefore, given the fact that all of us have worked with CSS, which is what I have been given to understand, and all of you mentioned it this morning. So I guess this is a legitimate question. How many versions of CSS do you think we have used or we had access to prior to CSS3? Now, the obvious is not the answer. The obvious one is going to be 2, CSS1, CSS2, and CSS3. That's not the answer. Therefore, the question. Take a guess. No problem if you're wrong. This isn't a test. I hope everyone understands the question.
So basically, you are asking about number of CSS versions, right?
Correct, Umar Shankar. Before version 3, because we're currently talking about 3.
Maybe only one, which is the CSS.
Okay. We had CSS, and now apparently we're talking about CSS3. All right. Any other opinion? Okay. I think I can kind of, relate to the situation many of us seem to be finding ourselves in. And correct me if I'm wrong. The thought that may be crossing our minds is, oh, we've used CSS, but when using CSS, we never ever mentioned a version number. So who knows how many versions? Only if it didn't work, we would have thought about all of that. So long as it worked, why bother? Whatever be the version, it worked. So that's something we were happy with. Okay, this is for the record. We have had 3 versions of CSS prior to CSS3, namely CSS version 1. CSS1 introduced formatting, the concept of formatting for the first time. Things like font, color, and all of that for the very first time was introduced in CSS with CSS1. Post which we saw the advent of CSS version 2. CSS version 2 again introduced a lot of features, in fact, more than a truckload of features. Amongst them, a very popular feature was the ability to position content. I'm sure every one of us can relate to this. When we talk about positioning, there are a few types of positioning. Can we name the types of positioning that we can resort to in CSS?
Relative, absolute and relative.
Absolute and relative. Is that it? Any other values that you may have come across or heard of in CSS? Broadly, we have 4 types of positioning. 1, absolute; 2, relative, as many of you have stated. We also then have fixed positioning, and there is something called static positioning. Positioning is an extremely interesting subject, a section of the CSS. Apparently, this concept was introduced in CSS version 2 amongst others. Let me quickly add I am not trying to say CSS2 only introduced the concept of positioning. This was one of the very popular concepts or popular features introduced in CSS2. CSS2 were introduced a lot of other features also. After this, we have had CSS version 2.1. Now, in CSS version 2.1, again, quite a number of enhancements, quite a number of new capabilities were introduced. Amongst them, I would like to just point out two standout new capabilities. One of them was support for a property called media, which said if you are attempting to style content, format content, you can do so on the basis of where this content will be rendered. So, for example, if the media happens to be the screen, how should it be formatted? If it happens to be the printer, meaning, oh, look, here is a page that will be printed, in which case, how should the styling be? Now, just for the sake of understanding, let's take this as an example. Imagine I'm viewing an email in my Gmail inbox. Eventually, when I choose to print it, the print version is not necessarily going to be the same as what I saw on the screen version of my email. There will be some subtle differences, including maybe some advertisements will not be there and things like that. So when you're targeting the medium and where would you want to have this content getting rendered, you can decide how to have stuff formatted. Media as a property introduced in CSS version 2.1. There were a couple of more values. I'll just stop at one. We also had something called handheld. So in case this was, targeting a handheld device, then how should the formatting be? This was one very, very popular property introduced in CSS version 2.1. In addition to this, we also have support for a property called viewport. This has been another property introduced in version 2.1 of CSS, viewport. In simple English, viewport represents the content that is viewable in the current browser window, as in the current screen, without scrolling up, scrolling down. The area that the content that can be shown in the current viewable region, that viewable region is what is designated as viewport. I'm just putting it in as simple English as possible. Okay, so some of the enhancements that have been a part of the iterations that CSS has seen. Presently, though, we intend to be looking at capabilities that are on offer in CSS as with regard to CSS version 3. Let's take a look at some prominent characteristics. I would like to address all occurrences of an element E. Now, notice the square brackets here. This has a little bit of a background to it. Quick question. In JavaScript, if I use square brackets, what would it represent?
Key,
Sorry, Srinath, could you say that again?
key for if it's an object, then key name goes in the square bracket.
Okay, plain vanilla JavaScript. If I use square brackets, the square bracket syntax, what might it represent? Forget about what is going inside the square bracket. As such, square brackets.
Array.
Indeed, array. The square bracket syntax will be used to represent an array. This is something we do in JavaScript. Have we all heard of something called XPath? I'll repeat that question again. Have we heard of something called XPath? Here is what I'm talking about. Is this a term we've heard of? Silence is golden, so I will assume silence indicates a no. Is that correct? My understanding?
No for me.
Okay. All right. Just a quick minute here. XPath stands for the XML path language, which happens to be a W3C standard specification. It is a mechanism that would help us traverse data structures. Provides us a mechanism that would help us traverse data structures, hierarchies. Uh, DOM, I guess that is something we're all familiar with. DOM, document object model. DOM uses XPath. All right. DOM uses XPath to navigate the hierarchical structure. The reason I brought this up is the square bracket syntax, the square bracket syntax that we have here in the current context. That is something that's been borrowed from XPath. I would not want you to misinterpret the square bracket as an array. Please note, in JavaScript, the square bracket would have denoted an array, which is why I asked everyone this question. Here in CSS, this is a concept that we have borrowed from XPath. The square bracket syntax in XPath would be called a filter. I repeat, we call it a filter. And that is something we have borrowed here into CSS. If I may go back to the slide, I would like to address all occurrences of an element E. Notice the square bracket, we call it a filter. An element E which has an attribute with a corresponding value. Now, the term within the filter, unless otherwise specified, will be used to depict an attribute. Yes, Ravindra, did you have a question? Let me repeat what I said again. I would want to address all occurrences of an element E, provided it has an attribute, whatever be the name of the attribute, with a corresponding value. So if you try to look at a slightly bigger picture, what we're trying to do is basically imposing a filter. I don't want all occurrences of an element. I want only those occurrences which satisfy this criterion. All right. So the square bracket here in the context of CSS, please be aware we use it to be depicting a filter. Apologies for digressing, but quick question nonetheless. In Angular, I'm digressing, I know, but just a quick question. There's an agenda there to my question. In Angular, are we familiar with creating directives, custom directives?
Yes.
Okay. If we are in a custom directive, let us suppose I do something like this. I'm sorry. I certainly would be able to do this. All right. And then I'm going to say selector. And let's suppose I do something like format. What does the square bracket here symbolize? Any idea? I hope this code is looking familiar. Is it? Is this looking familiar? Or is it something you're seeing for the first time?
The very XPath thing that you said?
No, no. It is not related, hence the question. It is not related, hence the question, because it's likely that the usages we are currently addressing, we may end up making some of these usages in Angular, which I guess is likely. Therefore, I've brought up this to make sure we don't mix things up. Now, when I do something like this in Angular, this term called format will represent a property. So I should be using format as a property on some DOM element. So let's say, for example, input. Format will be a property. It is an attribute directive. That's what we call it, an attribute directive. So there are these variations we'll need to be absolutely clear about. Normal JavaScript, square bracket, syntax would constitute an array. In CSS, square bracket syntax would represent a filter. Now, given the fact that we are using Angular, hence I brought this up, okay? It's likely that we may end up creating a directive, or at least we may end up doing something like this, or should we get to see something like this at least, we'd need to be aware of the fact that this has nothing to do with either of the other two. It is not representing an array. It isn't representing a filter either. It is representing a property, meaning that this will be used as a property on some DOM element. Okay, hence I brought this up. Okay, I know I digressed, my apologies, but the intent was just to make sure that when you look at this syntax, we don't mix them up. Let's get back. Further, I would like,
One question is here.
yes, Vinod?
Can we add multiple filters at a time? Filter conditions.
If you do, apparently that is something which is yet to be implemented by rendering engines per se, because it will evaluate to an AND clause in case you add another filter beside it. So let's imagine here I've said if foo is bar, and then I open another square bracket outside and put one more filter. That would evaluate to an AND clause. Technically, XPath supports those kinds of usages, but we will need to check if the rendering engine is capable of having that being implemented. At the moment, unfortunately, not all rendering engines are capable of doing so. They will eventually.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, next we're looking at addressing an element E if it happens to be the last child with respect to its parent. Here again, let's go back, and maybe I'm revisiting a little of our CSS knowledge here. In CSS, all of us know the hash would have represented what?
ID.
ID. Wonderful. The dot would have represented
Class.
class. Indeed. The colon would have represented sorry, Suman, I couldn't hear that.
Selector, I forgot.
Value assign.
Value. Okay. Now, I'm sure we would have all seen something like this. Have we? Have we seen something like this? If we have, would you want to say hover is a value?
Action.
Action. Okay. Or
Event, we can say.
event. Okay. In which case, let us suppose I also have something like this. Would you want to classify this also as an event? I don't suppose.
No,
So, okay. So, in which case, what would you think these are basically representing? Yes, Vinod?
Yes, but sometimes we use colon as a value, just like a width.
Yeah, we could do that. Perfectly. Yes. I agree. We could do that here.
Yes.
I mean, just for argument's sake, I'm putting a literal value there. I'm sure we could do this. This would be within the definition. It would be a part of the definition, but I'm talking about the colon being used here and here respectively. What would we call these? I'm sure we've all seen hover used extensively, isn't it?
We call it selector or something like that.
Selector. It is a selector, no questions about it. If I say just A, that is also a selector. Div, okay, that's also a selector. We have a name associated with this. This is pure CSS. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, just simple vanilla CSS. Because like we say hash used for ID, dot used for class, the colon has a meaning associated with it. There is a significance. Anybody? Okay. Ever heard of this term called a pseudo clause?
Yes.
Heard was the question. I promise you I'm not going to test your knowledge. Heard was the question. I hope you've heard of this term, have we?
Yes.
Yes. These are all pseudo clauses. Hover, first letter, first line, visited, active, unvisited. We've got a few like that. All right. Pseudo clauses. Well, some people would want to have this being because it's being used in conjunction with an element. They also would want to attribute it as an element, pseudo element, but technically we'd want to just use the term pseudo clauses. Okay. Now, in CSS 3, we're looking at a few new such usages being offered to us. Notice last child. It is saying if an element happens to be the last child with respect to its parent, then there is some styling that I would like it to be associated with. Here I haven't mentioned which is the parent element, so it could be any parent. If an element E is enabled, so quite logically we're talking about a form field here. A form field can be enabled or disabled. So if an element happens to be enabled, what is excuse me, what is the style that I would like it to be associated with? If an element happens to be in the checked state, checked state would be in the context of a checkbox or a radio button. If it's checked, okay, what styling may I want it to be associated with it? And finally, in this case, I've said first of type. The first occurrence of an element on the page, and what would I want to do with it? What kind of styling would I like it to be associated with? First of type would mean basically the first occurrence of an element in a particular context. If I have not put up a parent, then it simply means on the current page. What styling would I want it to be associated with? I would like all of you to please open a file titled HTML page 06. HTML page 06 in a code editor. HTML page 06. Please open this in a code editor. First things first, let us examine the markup and then we will get to the CSS. I just would like everyone to examine the structure, the markup. So I've gotten to the body section, as you can notice here. There apparently are two occurrences of the paragraph which are adjacent to one another. ID first, ID second, respectively, two adjacent occurrences of the paragraph. Likewise, two occurrences of the div adjacent to one another. And on my screen, if you can observe line number 54, the div has not been closed properly. That is not a typo. That's intentionally done. Because if you know, for some reason, a particular tag is not closed, or if it has to be closed and it hasn't been, we don't expect the browser to start complaining. Remember, we would like to retain that flexibility, that leniency, and as in backward compatibility. So the browser is not going to complain about, you know, the tag not being closed and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the third occurrence of the paragraph, notice its location. It's been placed just before the closure of the body tag. All right. Third occurrence of the paragraph. In this example, I've done this intentionally. So I could use the structure in my formatting. Now, there is a text field. It's enabled. There is a checkbox, which apparently at this point in time is not checked. If you notice, it's just a checkbox which has not been checked. So it's in an unchecked state. Okay. Now we will take a look at the CSS section. From the looks of it, what kind of a CSS would you want to call this? What kind of a CSS, I repeat, would you want to call this?
Internal.
Internal. Is there another name that we could use?
Inline.
Inline.
Is this inline?
No.
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 Okay, so internal is correct. Is there another name that we could associate it with? Internal can also be called
Document level.
okay, document level, all right. Any other terminology that you may have come across? Anybody for that matter? Okay, Apparently, have you heard of a term called embedded?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Internal style sheets, also known as embedded style sheets. Now, the reason why many people prefer to use the term embedded instead of internal is there have been cases where the term internal and inline have appeared to be a little confusing. English, believe me, is a very interesting language, and at times you might end up with an ambiguity, though there is none. There have been instances where internal and inline have seemed to be confusing, which is why there are people who prefer to use the word embedded instead of internal, just for the sake of ensuring clarity. All right. This is an internal style sheet or an embedded style sheet, so to speak. And here's what we've done. I have said I want to address a paragraph element if it happens to be the last child with respect to its parent. Incidentally, in our case, this particular occurrence of the paragraph, the one on line number 59, this is the last paragraph with respect to its parent, last child with respect to its parent, which happens to be body. The body happens to be the parent. So after this, there is no other child element. Body, this is the last child. So last occurrence of the paragraph. And I want to style it in a particular way. And then all occurrences of the paragraph, this is where I'm attempting to employ a filter. Notice the usage of the square brackets. Remember, we are employing this in CSS, therefore filter. I would like to address all occurrences of the paragraph which have a property called align, whose value is right. In our case, there is only one such paragraph in my document, align right, and that is the one that I would be addressing with that filter. Some formatting. If an input field is checked, input colon checked, notice that. If there is an input field which is in a checked state, then I want to do something. Please remember, I pointed out that initially I have a checkbox and it is unchecked. So the moment it is checked, this will be applicable. All right. Further, div colon first of type. Just a gentle reminder, on this page, I pointed out there are two divs, div colon first of type. So it's like saying the first occurrence of the div on the page is something that I'm interested in. Only the first occurrence of the div is what I'm interested in. I want to do some formatting. And finally, input field, if it is enabled and the ID happens to be txt name. It might seem a little, out of sequence, but if I translate this into English, it's like saying, look for an element whose ID is txt name. A txt name element, that's the ID I'm looking for. If it's an input field, and if it happens to be in an enabled state, then there is some formatting I would like it to be associated with. If it's not enabled, this formatting will not be applicable. So I'm trying to narrow down to an element with an ID. If it is an input type, and if input element that is, and if it happens to be enabled, only then I would want this to be done. It would be really interesting for us to examine this in the browser. So could all of you please open this page in a web browser? I'd like all of you to please open this page in a web browser. And I presume this is what we end up seeing. The first div is what's been formatted, as you can notice. The first div, this hello div world. The second div, no format whatsoever. All right, because we've said first of type. And then we have the paragraphs being formatted. The second paragraph, it has an align property, so I asked something to be done to it. And the last child, the paragraph which appears just prior to the body tag being closed, that happens to be the last child. So I said I want to add some formatting to that. You see that being effective. Then there's this text box. I said if the ID happens to be txt name, if it's an input field, and if it's enabled, then I said I want some formatting. If you can notice, it's kind of having a border. I hope that's visible. And finally, this checkbox, I check it. Okay, it moved. I uncheck it. It reverts because I've given it a margin, and that's something that's happening. Let me quickly tell you, for some of these kind of activities, especially the checkbox stuff, previously we may have been compelled to use a little of JavaScript, maybe one line or one or max of 2 lines of JavaScript code. We might have been compelled to do that. Fortunately, those are usages that are now being supported right out of the box using CSS. So we're basically heading in that direction. If you recollect, we would want to, whatever possible, we would want to address using HTML and CSS. Only thing that where we see need for dynamism, okay, we would want to bring in scripts in particular. All right, so a few features that we have currently